Hello and welcome back. From here on in, it's going to be all about color correction. And there's a few techniques you can use to make that image look like you were there. And that's really a problem with photography in general with these digital cameras, is that the sensor does not behave the way the retina of the eye does. So uh, often what you see is not the way it really looked. It's in a close approximation. Like what you see here is, yeah, it's a dog with some sitting on a chair here, but that, I guarantee you, it didn't look like this when you were sitting out there. So we're going to try to bring some of that back. And this is related to the way we treated the image in Camera Raw, intentionally keeping things a little washed out and deferring the gratification. Well, now comes the payoff. A little bit of technique I'm going to show you. I've developed myself. Some of this I've gathered from different sources, but the settings and the order of doing it, I don't know of anyone else doing it this way, and I invite you to give it a try. So here we go. We're going to be actually altering some pixels here, and this cloning and healing layer, it's on its own layer. So I want to be able to take everything you see here and bring it into one layer, but still keep my components should I ever need to change my mind down here. And you do this by choosing the top layer, turning off all the eyeballs on the layers that you don't want. And you can do it two ways. You can click here and say merge visible, but hold the Alt key down while you do it. Or a simple keyboard shortcut is just hit Control Alt Shift E, and it merges everything up. It'd be Command Option Shift E on a Mac. Now eventually we'll be doing some color correction using the adjustment layers of curves, levels, and hue and saturation. But for this initial stuff, we're actually going to be permanently altering these pixels. I'm going to call this layer Shadow Highlight. And we're going to go up to the Shadow Highlight filter, which is under Image, Adjustments, Shadow Highlight. It may well be that someday in the future this will be available to you as an editable adjustment layer, but right now it's a one-time affair. So when you select it from up here, it's permanently altering the pixels. So we'll select Shadow Highlight. Now this is going to look a little different when you bring it up. I believe these settings are all somewhere like this. This is set 0.01. This is what? Something in this neighborhood things will look like. But what we're essentially trying to do is you can see the histogram up here, the before and after, is we want to bring everything into the visible range of what it looked like that day. Then we're going to do another technique to increase the contrast so that the darks are dark and the lights are light. The settings I'd like to show you here, we'll start off and we're going to turn the amount to 100. Now this thing works by making calculations based on neighboring pixels, and for the radius, I'm going to go with an amount of 100 on both of these, the highlights and the shadows. And if you don't see these, it's under Show More Options. Click this and it opens this up. I can start off with the amount 100, the amount 100 here. Now I don't want it to clip at all. I want to totally preserve this histogram. So that little bit 0.01 basically means that they're allowing the tiniest bit of clipping in order to keep the very darkest darks dark and the lightest lights light. However, we're going to do that in the next step without any danger of clipping. So I'm going to set this to 0, and you'll see how your image just got a little bit lighter, but no problem. The next setting is the tonal width. 50 means from 50% gray down the shadows. I've done quite a bit of experimenting with this, and I've come to the conclusion that 40 really nails it. It's getting the darks, but just the right amount of chunk of the darks. And on the highlights here, I'm only concerned with the lightest light, so I'm going to put this at 10. It's just going to, basically this causes the lightest lights to get the lights to get a little darker and the darks to get a little lighter, as you can see what's here. And you can view this if you have your histogram open and even select that little, when you see that exclamation point, that means it's got to recalculate. So there's the histogram before, and there's the preview of what it would look like once I click OK. And you can see it basically it pushes all the values towards the center, but in a more of a realistic distribution. Of course, nothing too realistic here. It's a little over the top. But if you start off with 100, 40, 100, 110, 100, and the color correction by default will say plus 20, if you drop it down to plus 10, it's going to take a little bit of that saturation, knock it down, because too much saturation will also cause clipping. And here we go. Now what we do is we're just going to dial the amount down to a reasonable amount. This number here, we've got it dialed up to 100. Whatever you do to this one, you can set to the highlights to the same amount. So I'm just going to go down a little bit, and we're going to try to make this thing look realistic, but not over the top. See the before and after? How it's bringing all the values back just like you were there. Now there's two ways to go about this. You can overdo it a little bit and simply dial down on the opacity of this layer to let the original mix with it. And so when you set this, we'll err on just doing it slightly too much. You know, I used to tell my students, I'd say, well, go for 100 and then just dial down the opacity of this layer. But I've since come to figure out that really there's no use overdoing it. That way we can keep as much of this layer as feasible. This one, you'll see the highlight in certain images. It'll really show if it's a tendency towards clipping. Here, this doesn't seem to be having much an effect at all, but I'll generally set this amount to the same that I choose for here. So we'll just dial with this shadows amount here. Now, don't be too shy with this thing. You don't want it looking fake like a cartoon, but in the next step, we're going to increase the contrast, make these darks really dark. So what we're concerned mainly with here are the midtones that it looks fairly accurate, like if we were there that day. You know, like, so I'll give it a good amount. We'll say like 60%, 70. How about that little? And I'll set this to 70. So to reiterate here, I've got the tonal width of the shadows to 40% and a 100 pixel radius. If the camera, this is I guess a 10 megapixel camera or 12, something around that area. When you get the high-end cameras that are 20 megapixels and up, you'd want to put this radius up a little bit accordingly. But for these mid-level cameras, 10 to 12 megapixel range, radius of 100 will do just fine, where you don't notice any halos around, which we'll talk about in the next video. And on the highlights, we'll keep the tonal width down to just a 10%, just knocking off the top. Color correction adjustments, we're leaving this at 10, and then I've put zeros here, so no clipping. And I'm going to say save as defaults. So the next time I open this, this will be our initial setting. And we'll click OK. And it's chewing over it. Now I try to avoid merging up like we did as much as possible, because the more layers you get like this, it makes it harder to change your mind. There's two ways you can look at this. If we keep this whole layer intact, for the next step, all I have to do is duplicate this layer, and I'll have a duplication of everything we see here. However, if I'm planning on dropping the opacity of this layer slightly, which maybe I will, just a little bit. Let's say I just went a little over the top here and it's just too cartoony, they're too bright, and we're just going to temper it a little bit like this. Well, the next step then, I would have to merge up the same way as we did before, and we'll cover that in the next video.